All right, so let's look at the relationship between art and philosophy. As I've already mentioned, Nietzsche had this sense that the key to the impasse beyond the Christian worldview of the world was in the Dionysian spirit that is to be found in art, particularly music. Nietzsche, it could be said, and I think this is a little bit of an exaggeration, but it's not too much of an exaggeration. I think Nietzsche could say that there is any kind of Nietzschean redemption, if not a kind of Nietzschean eschatology, which we'll get to when we talk about Zarathustra and the whole idea of the overman. That there is a redemption, a salvation, an eschatology. It's to be found in not so much art as a project, art as a profession, art as a sort of form of techne, of production of what we would call works of art, but art as creativity. And in some ways the key to art is not to look at artworks, not to look at the lives of artists, not to look at even the manifestos of artists, but to ask the question with somebody like Duchamp, the founder of Dadaism and one of the revolutionaries in modern art who continued on into the postmodern era as being an influential presence and force. What Duchamp, Marcel Duchamp, called the creative act. So in a sense, Nietzsche was concerned with art as creative act. He wanted to get into the very kind of essence, the very depth, the very kinetics of creativity. So, and like many people around him in Germany at the time, he was fascinated with a guy by the name of Richard Wagner, and also a philosopher who was, in some ways, his childhood idol by the name of Arthur Schopenhauer. Now, Schopenhauer has a reputation as being a pessimist. Anybody here ever heard of Schopenhauer? Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. And, of course, anybody here not heard of Richard Wagner? Anybody ever seen a Wagnerian opera performed? Yeah, okay. Anybody a kind of Wagner fan? No. Anybody go to Bayreuth? Or, I guess in Seattle they perform Wagner here from time to time. Though, you get into the ring of the Nibelungen, it's like 4, 5, 6, 7 hours, it's like, no way. That's just a little bit trying, watching, all these guys with, cow helmets on their head marching around all the time in circles and so on. But Schopenhauer was, in some ways, the first IMAX theoretician. He was the one who developed the idea of what in German is called a Gesamtkunstwerk, or literally the total artwork. Art should be enveloping. Art should be thoroughly penetrating of the mind and the imagination so that, in a sense, one is living within the performance. Of course, the dark side of this is that because Wagner was such an institution of German culture, in many ways, he didn't invent the technology of motion pictures or of wraparound sound or 3D cinema or whatever, but the kind of idea that art must be more than a spectator's sport. This comes from Wagner. And for him, there must be a kind of livingness of art so that, in a sense, one is participating. And interestingly, that was Nietzsche's whole view of the tragic. The tragic was not something you watch, as it became, in the theater of Aristotle's day, when Aristotle, gave in the Poetics his principles of tragedy. But art is something that we would say is lived religiously. It is a communal activity. You become involved in some kind of communal being You are immersed in it through the practice of art. And so ritual and art are very hard to distinguish from each other, and this is what he's getting at in The Birth of Tragedy. That music is always about not just the genesis of emotion. Music is about creating a kind of total experience which I, as a participant, now can experience as something much larger than myself. That's why, we have worship services. One could argue that the whole transformation of Christianity in the 1980s into what we now call contemporary worship and contemporary worship form, even to a large extent the whole busting out of the charismatic movement during this early period can be attributed to the music, the change in music, electrification, the development of a concert, the theatrics of art performance. Up until the 1960s, music was seen as basically something that kind of stimulated the emotions, if not the instincts. That's why it was so feared by parents in the 1950s, at least rock and roll. And of course, there was a reason to fear that, because the word rock and roll was actually street slang for like the sex act. And so, but a lot of parents didn't know that, but that's actually why the term was used by the early pioneers of rock and roll. It was supposed to, in a sense, create an instinctual sound that would lead to the feeling of emancipation of one's kind of animal proclivities. The anxiety experienced in the 1950s over Elvis was not misplaced, it was real. Elvis appealed to that and so forth. That, you could call that Dionysian. But there's more to the Dionysian than just the sexual or the erotic or the instinctual or the stimulation of a feeling and emotion, wanting to get up and dance, wanting to sort of let go and exceed the limits of what would be considered acceptable behavior. That what the Dionysian is also about is about immersion. It's about immersion. It's about creation of a whole new aesthetic environment which transforms the mind. It transforms a person through this participation. And of course you see this in Paul, when he's talking about membership in the body of Christ. This is not, the same as membership in a voluntary association or in a civic club. This is not you pay your dues and you get your privileges. This is like you are changed radically. The new being that is in Christ. And he kind of uses the language, or at least something that is resonant with the language of the mystery religions, particularly in this theology of Christ participation that is so prominent, particularly in 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Yeah.
Kurt, I just have a question. I kind of want to know what you think about this.
And by the way, I just want to say one thing. I had a student years ago who's now a professor at the University of Colorado at Denver, actually chair of the department, who wrote a very interesting thesis years ago on how we can look at early Christianity as a kind of Dionysian kind of movement. I mean, even as in the Gospel of John, he's talking about the vine and all that sort of stuff. I mean, Jesus says, "I am the vine." That's all out of the language of the Dionysian cult, to a certain extent. So your question was?
My question is, I'm a little bit conflicted in understanding how his ideas, specifically of like the art performance, and his ideas of like the herd mentality are different. Because to me, like, a group of people experiencing an artistic performance has a similar effect.
Throwing each other in the mosh pit and that kind of stuff.
Sure. Or just like experiencing something like that would create, essentially he's saying like immersion to me similar language as like immersing yourself in a group of people,
Yeah,
like the herd mentality.
A kind of a transpersonal immersion. What about it?
I'm wondering if like he ever comments on that being similar, or if that's like a higher essence of like herd mentality, because it seems to me that his desire in the immersion of an artistic experience is to create like a common expression of emotion.
Well, it's not more of a, and it's interesting that Nietzsche, in his later writings, when he gets kind of wrapped up with his critique of Christianity, sort of abandons, the whole sort of thematic vision of the Dionysian, or at least he doesn't talk a lot about it, though in his so-called mad period from the late, from around 1890 onwards, he starts talking about Dionysus again. In fact, his last recorded words are Dionysus or the crucified. Have you understood, and so forth. And so you see this kind of what we might call this almost this unconscious identification with this Dionysian Christ. That Dionysus is a force that rips through all structures and is constantly, undermining these structures. Arthur Schumpeter's, who's an economist, coined this line about capitalism as creative destruction. Well, from a religious point of view, that's Dionysus. So there was there in Nietzsche very much. You say that Nietzsche had this kind of Dionysian spirit. He wasn't interested in intellectual critique. He was trying to find, in some ways, a new source for transformation and redemption that wasn't all wrapped up in Christian dogmatics. You might say, in this kind of foundational notion that involved the church and, and whatever that was, really part of the history of Christendom. But I thought the first part of your question was, well, isn't this the same as the herd mentality? Where Nietzsche is critiquing, what might be called a common moral reactivity, this sort of mass of raisonnement that, somehow epitomizes democratic culture and our tendency to sort of condemn and reject and demand, things that will essentially, confirm our pointlessness and pettiness. I mean, the herd mentality, what is a herd? Let's get to that question. A herd is not a mass movement, right? A herd is basically where everybody sort of does what everybody else does, almost in lockstep.
But isn't that also, the point of going to a performance is putting a group of people, especially if you're talking about Wagner, an opera, you're putting a group of people in an opera house to experience one performance.
Yeah.
And if it's whatever that word is, the total artwork.
But Nietzsche hated Wagner for I think the reasons you're getting at. Nietzsche was not a fan of Wagner. In fact, he was at first, he was kind of infatuated with Wagner's idea, but he considered Wagner to be a sort of propagandist for the herd mentality. They didn't have a word for it, but his sort of his disdain for Wagner was based on the same kind of disdain he had for anti-Semitism and this sort of new, nationalistic collectivism and conformism that later would blossom into fascism. He hated all that because he was not an apostle of conformism. Dionysianism and conformism aren't the same thing. If I go to a concert, or let's say I go to a very intense rock, take something like Woodstock, okay? Woodstock is sort of the model of this, and that's what I was trying to get to in a minute ago, was in the 1960s, all of a sudden music turned performance. Because it became performance, it became political. Now in that way it was used for the mobilization of democratic revolutionary aspirations, but it was also used to mobilize the German nation following Wagnerian recipes for the Gesamtkunstwerk. It was used to mobilize the nation in such a way that you had this dark and violent form of collective egotism that we know as Nazism and so forth. And the Nuremberg rallies, which are probably the most obvious, historical instantiations of that idea. People walking around with. I mean, these were like, in some ways, religious rituals. They were orchestrated to bring out the sense of the primitive folk, and the rising of the folk, in defiance against all those who were persecuting it from the outside, those who imposed the Versailles Treaty and so forth and so forth. Nietzsche would have been contemptuous of that, because for Nietzsche, creativity is always about individual expression, okay? And so, in other words, let's say for Nietzsche, put it very simply, creativity is not about Dionysian madness. Creativity is about learning to use the Apollonian impulse to discipline the Dionysian in such a way that it becomes a powerful expression of art. And the movement in the fine arts, German Expressionism, which flourished during the 19-teens and the 1920s, and probably had its signature its signature epitomization in the Blue Rider movement that was based in Munich in the 1920s. Vasily Kandinsky was the leader of that. That was an effort to try to bring Nietzsche's philosophy down to earth, to make it a real, kind of lived philosophy, a lived philosophy that was expressed in the purest way that the expression is considered to be, the purest way you can express it, which is art, and so forth. So art is not just a kind of collective mania. Art is, in a sense, taking these energies of collective mania and disciplining it in your own way in a unique form of expression. Art requires a certain kind of solitude. It requires a breaking with the rules, a breaking with the expectations of the masses. It's the opposite in many ways because of this Apollonian intervention that I'm talking about. It's a breaking with, this sort of, you might say, the deep, archaic herd impulses that can be found in Dionysus.
Can I ask a follow-up question to the Apollonian intervention?
Yeah.
Because to me, the word intervention implies that...
I just threw that out there for it.
Okay. Well, but the fact that it's an Apollonian intervention in, like, the creative act already means that it's chaotic to begin with. It's
Yes,
already
right. It is chaotic, yeah. It's a chaos that drives creativity.
Then I guess I'm just confused at why he doesn't like... It doesn't seem like he likes or respects the mind of the artist.
He does like it. He does. Quite the opposite. Art is salvation. That's what I've been saying all along.
Okay. Well,
Doesn't it? Where did you get that impression?
from everything I read in the book.
Really?
Yeah.
How many of you thought that? That's kind of weird. I've never. Because Nietzsche's had such a profound impact on the art. How many of you got that idea?
He writes about how he hates Wagner.
Huh?
And he talks about how the mind of the artist is someone who, like, I will find specific passages.
All right,
He loves Bizet. He writes pages on how wonderful Carmen is.